So hello, good morning. Thanks for coming here today. My name's Beth Hannah, and this is Spencer Dilworth. We're going to introduce our topic, and then we're going to introduce the students, and then each student, individually or in groups, they'll come up and do their portion explaining our research in detail.
Just before we get started, we want to make a couple things clear. We are just undergraduate students. This isn't like a PhD paper, and it's just exploratory research for study of Utah residents' attitudes toward the death penalty. Studying nationally doesn't make sense because not all or every state has a death penalty. Plus, there are differences in those states that do have the death penalty. So cultural, demographically, it doesn't make sense to look at it at a national scale. Yeah, that's just what I said. I guess we're a slide behind. Anyway.
Okay, and like Spencer just said, again, this is an exploratory research project that we're undergoing as undergrads, and so we want to let you know that we're not trying to persuade you any way or the other. We also we want to make it clear that we're not defending or condemning the death penalty in either way, so we make it a practice not to even know each other's opinions of the death penalty, just to keep it totally unbiased. So this is an exploratory. We don't even know what we're going to find out, but whatever it is, we're going to know that we're guaranteeing that we're going to make it as unbiased as possible with our questions and our analysis. We are concerned with what is okay. We are concerned for what is and not what ought to be. So we're going to explain to you now what the A students are. So we are the A team. We consist of 10 students. We were, like Sandy said, we were handpicked out of her previous classes because we are A students, let's admit it.
Basically, we're here because we're the best of the best of the best, and we were handpicked by Sandy and showed interest in this.
True. We aspire to doing undergrad research here, all of us. I could speak, I believe, for myself, and we all have the same attitude. Also, A is also, but not only are we A students, we also want to say that A also stands for the attitudes that we're going to study of the Utah citizens on their attitudes on the death penalty. So I want to go over the format of what we're going to go through here today. Spencer and I are going to introduce the students now, and then after that, each student, like I said, are going to come up individually or in groups depending on their topic, and they're going to go through everything, and then at the end, Spencer and I are going to come back up here and we will conclude our talk, and then we're going to take questions. So please challenge us and give us lots of questions to answer. Thank you.
So our program is as it follows. As you can see, George Beard is going to talk about international context on the capital punishment. Following him, Tyler McDonald will talk nationally on the death penalty, and Cariana Every and Amin Martin will talk about the death penalty and Utah specifically. Zachary Cook and Shelby Radquist will talk about our methods, and following them will be Amy Sachs and Harmony Joette, and the purpose of our research. And then, like Beth said, following them, Beth and I will come up and conclude and open it up to questions and answering. So just leave your comments and questions till the end. That would be great. And we'll turn the time over now to George.
Thanks, Beth and Spencer. Just to reintroduce myself, I am George Rivera, and I'll be talking to you about the international context and the trends that have been going on internationally for the last century, I guess. So I just wanted to start a little bit with the Nuremberg Trials. After World War II, it was the first time that the the World Court actually decided to hold their leaders accountable for the actions that happened during a war. And at this time, they were using execution as a method, or as a method of punishment, I guess, for the war crimes that were done. And so throughout the trials, there was a lot of bias towards it from the conquering countries. There was a punctuated equilibrium after that point where we saw a lot of progress and then a lot of relapse. And so it would continue and just go forward, and then it would stop, and then go forward and go stop. And so these were also the last time that we had an execution trial, with the exception of Iraq. And the reason why Iraq had a little bit more of a different take on it was because of the American influence that was on there. And since then, there was really no need for the World Court's involvement until the 1990s, when we had Rwanda and Yugoslavia. But we'll talk about that next. So again, in the late 1980s, most of the European countries had abolished the death penalty. And so because of that, when the 1990s came along and Yugoslavia and Rwanda had their own civil wars and leaders needed to be accountable, most of them did not want to utilize the death penalty in it. And so even then, in the early 2000s, that's when the World Court actually abolished the death penalty completely. And so it was no longer an option for war crimes. So then there was a lot of international involvement between countries now, and a lot of debate going on where criminals may flee to Canada, France, or Mexico, for example. And a lot of those countries refuse to extradite these people because of possibility of the death penalty. So if the US takes off the death penalty as an option, then they're more likely to extradite those criminals to us. Mexico has also taken a very strong role in trying to get their citizens out of our death row and back to their country so that they do not have to go through the death penalty. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about the United Nations and their position on the entire context of the death penalty. In 2007, they had a moratorium, which basically decided that they would take a brief respite from any convictions on the death penalty or actual executions. 104 countries agreed to this, and then there were 54 countries that were against, and with 29 abstaining. And as you can see, throughout the years, it kind of just increased, where now we have 109 countries that were for it and 41 against. And the trends just seem to keep going in that direction. This is a map that I pulled off of Wikipedia. It basically just shows all of the red countries which are against the moratorium, and all of the green countries which are for it. The yellow countries are those that are abstaining. So this just gives you a good idea of how many countries are actually against the death penalty and how many are for it. So this increasing trend has just gone on for several decades now. Over 70 countries since 1970 have actually abolished the death penalty, or they are not practicing it. And there are increasing countries all the time that are doing stuff. The latest statistic that I could find from amnesty.org was that 2010 we had Gabon and and 4 other countries, I believe, that were in the works of getting rid of their death penalty. So there's another term that we need to start talking about, which is called the abolitionists. These are the countries that have abolished the death penalty completely, or they have abolished it for ordinary crimes, or they have abolished it in practice, which just basically means that they have not put anyone on death row, and they haven't executed anyone for over 10 years. And so these are just the different types of countries. They're all over. And so in order to be a part of the European Union, which I consider to be one of our close allies, they have to actually be an abolitionist country, and they should not have any ties with the death penalty in order to be inducted into the European Union. They decided that it was cruel and inhumane, and that it just doesn't fit with their purpose, and therefore they just do not think that it should be a part of the European Union. There's another group of people, those that retain the death penalty, and they're referred to as the retentionists. And this is just a list of all the retentionist countries in the world. And notice the ones that are in red. The US just so happens to be one of the countries that does retain the death penalty. And it's just interesting and curious to see who we choose to align ourselves with as far as the death penalty is concerned. Now, this is just a little chart that I found from 2010. I couldn't find anything more recent, sorry about that. But this just gives a brief overview of how everything occurred in 2010. And it's interesting, too, because there is really no set pattern. It's not really certain as to what is appropriate and what is not. For example, there were 4 men that were executed within an hour of their conviction down in Ecuador. China carried out more death sentences than most of the world put together. And there was just 23 countries carried out executions, and so it's really interesting to see that there are really no set patterns and there are really no trends as far as the death penalty is concerned throughout the world. And so this just leads into the next topic that we're going to discuss, which is the national context. So I'd just like to introduce Tyler McDonald, who will talk about that.
Thanks, George. Thank you, everybody. So I'm Tyler McDonald, and I'm going to be talking about the death penalty on the national scale. 1 sec. So this graph that we've got here, this basically shows how many people were executed between the years of 1977 to 2012. And as you can see, in 1999 we have the highest executions, which goes to 98. And so basically the reason why it started at 1977, I'm going to go through that a little bit. Basically in 1972, in the case of Furman versus Georgia, basically Furman argued that the death penalty lacked certain guidelines. And because it lacked certain guidelines, they felt that it basically branched on the principle, or it basically went against cruel and unusual punishment. And because of that, they argued that it was unconstitutional, and so it went against the 8th and 14th Amendments. And so basically in a hearing on June 29th, 1972, the Supreme Court actually basically agreed with them, saying that this was cruel and unusual. And so basically, the administration of the death penalty was actually the thing that was being argued as cruel and unusual. And basically, because of that, it kind of got banned for a few years. And so within a few years of that, basically a bunch of states, 16 states, started to enact new legislation on the death penalty. And they did this basically because the death penalty itself wasn't actually banned. The way that it was being administered was banned. And so they were trying to basically get the death penalty reinstated by changing the legislation that was out there for it. And so while the 16 states were doing that, 4 other states such as Georgia, Illinois, Montana, and Texas, and Utah, basically they started to formalize guidelines that ensured that basically the people who needed to, the judges and juries, would account for specific factors when deciding whether or not to impose the actual death penalty on somebody. And so it basically ended up taking, I believe, 5 cases, and it was the case of Gregg versus Georgia that actually eventually ended up doing it on July 2nd of 1976. The Supreme Court basically became satisfied with the guidelines that were basically out there for people, or basically out there for the death penalty. And they basically reenacted at that point the death penalty in 1976. And so that's actually, if you remember back to the graph, that's why it starts in 1977, because that's when the death penalty was, that was the year, 1976 was when it was reenacted, and 1977 was when the first death was actually accounted for. And so who ends up getting the death penalty basically in the US today? Well, as we're going to look at it, we can kind of point at race, gender, and geography, that they actually do play a pretty significant part in this. And so going on to race, those executed since 1976 up to the point of April 1st, 2012 are 1,289 people. As that applies to race, basically we see that white people, the number of executed people are 724, which makes up 56.17% of the population. And then for the black race, you've got 444 executed people, which is 34.45%, which normally you'd probably look at that and you say, well, more white people are being executed than black people or pretty much anybody else. But to be honest, the numbers there don't actually match up. And so if you actually look at the Census Bureau, it's calculated that 13.6% of the population in America is black, while 72.4% of the white population exists. And so because of that, basically the ratio there just doesn't add up. We're basically executing more black people, Latino, and Native American people or whatever, as it applies to the ratio of people who actually consume our population than we are actual white people. And so basically the graph down there represents the numbers. So, and then as it applies to gender, very, very few females have actually been executed. As you can see, only 12 females have been executed, which is less than 1% of the population of the US. While males, 1,277 have been executed, which is 99.07% of the population. And then as it applies to geography, real quick, 33 states still have the death penalty. And then the US government and the military still enforce capital punishment as well. And so I'm actually just going to go over the first 3 states real quick. I've only listed a few here. But Texas, since the year of 1977, has executed 481 people, which actually consumes 37.32% of the executions that have taken place since then. And then Virginia has executed 109 people, which is 8.46%. And then Oklahoma, 98 executions, which is 7.6. And then basically added up all those together or whatever, those 3 states actually consume more than half of the basically half of the executions that have taken place since 1976. And so as it applies to the actual death row, there are currently 3,176 people on death row at the moment. And as that applies again to race, we've got the race breakdown. Basically, white inmates is 1,375, which is 43% of the people that are on death row right now. Black people are 1,325, which is 42%. Latino, 394, which is 12%. And like I said before, basically as that breaks down to the actual race ratio as it applies to the US, we can see that there are significantly more black people as it applies to their ratio than there are white people on death row right now. And with that, I'm actually going to hand this off to Ammon and Kariana, and they're going to basically talk to us about the death penalty as it applies to Utah.
All right, I'm Kariana, and this is Ammon, and we will be discussing why it's important for us to explore the attitudes of Utahns towards the death penalty. There has been national and international level research done on attitudes towards the death penalty, but there has not been a lot of research done on a state level, and that's important for us to be looking at those opinions on a state level, and I'll explain that using this graph. This graph represents the population of the United States, which is over 300 million people. That population can be broken down into 50 states, each of those states they have very different political backgrounds, they have different demographics, and they all have differing opinions. Each of those states differ on whether or not they allow the death penalty. Some of them outlaw the death penalty while others still actively use it. And even the states that have the death penalty, some of them think that certain methods of execution are unconstitutional, while others think that those methods are constitutional. So this little green sliver here represents the population of Utah, which is about 3 million. Less than 1% of the national population. So as you can see, Utah only accounts for such a small percentage of that population, so it's possible that the opinions of Utahns are being overlooked. And this is particularly important for us to be looking at the Utahns' opinions because we find that Utah possibly has some unique characteristics. So probably one of the most well-known reasons why Utah is unique is due to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also referred to as the Mormons. The Mormons of Utah are the only religious group in the U.S. that comprises a numerical majority of a state's population. So 57%, more than half of Utah's residents, identify themselves as belonging to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This number is actually unique because these are only the people that identify themselves as being part of the church, but the number is actually higher if you go off of the LDS church records. The number is 68%, but that doesn't really account for, or that does account for inactivity, people who go to church but who don't claim that they go to church. I think so. So Democrats or Republican, there is a difference between the Democratic and Republican Party on their opinions towards the death penalty. Both tend to favor the death penalty. However, 80% of Republicans say that they do support the death penalty, while only 58% of Democrats say they support the death penalty. So this is important when we're looking at Mormons. Mormons are more likely to favor the Republican Party than other Americans, and also Mormons that live in Utah are more likely to be Republican and less likely to be Democrats than Mormons outside of Utah. And these two pie charts show that 66% of Mormons in Utah say that they're Republican, while only 56% of Utahns outside of Utah say that they're Republican. So we kind of find that if you live in Utah, there's a greater chance of you identifying yourself as being LDS, which also, if you identify yourself as LDS, you're more likely to be Republican, and if you're Republican, you're more likely to favor the death penalty.
All right. For the death penalty in Utah, after the reinstatement of the death penalty, Utah was definitely one of the states that decided to continue the use of it. And one thing that stood out was that as one of the options for execution that was able to be selected for the death penalty was the firing squad. Most people, other states, well, the primary method is lethal injection, and other states have also used electrocution, the electric chair. But Utah was unique in that it offered the firing squad. And something else that stood out even more was that only 1 year after the moratorium ended, Utah became the first state to actually carry out an execution, and the method used was the firing squad. And that famous case was Gary Gilmore. He became very famous at the time for his decision to do so, and it got a lot of attention nationally. A few statistics here. Utah doesn't rank quite as high as Texas. It's had 7 executions since 1976, 3 of which have used the firing squad. There's 9 people currently on death row, and 4 of them have chosen the firing squad as their preferred method of the death penalty. And it's interesting that Utah has been the only state that's actually done the firing squad. A couple of other states have had it as an option before, but no one's used it except Utah. Currently, it's not an option to choose the firing squad as a form of the death penalty, as your method of execution. Because in May 3rd, 2004, it was May 3rd, 2004, it was ruled that it would only be offered as a secondary option, which means that if the primary form of execution, which is lethal injection, is ruled to be unconstitutional, which often relates to being inappropriate or impractical, then the other option to choose from would be the firing squad. And the option here in parentheses that says the inability to find suitable vein for IV. There can be, case by case, there could be reasons why the lethal injection might not be constitutional or might be additionally cruel or not work as well. So for those reasons, there's a secondary option in Utah that the firing squad can be used as a form of execution. However, if anyone was on death row before May 3rd, 2004, and they chose that they want to be executed by the form of the firing squad, Utah will hold to that decision, and they can still be executed by that method. And that was the case. Just in 2010, Ronnie Lee Gardner, which also garnered not just national but international attention to Utah, he was executed, and he was the 3rd person on that list of 3 executions done by death penalty, done by a firing squad. And so Those are just a few things that we've covered with the Mormon culture and the use of the firing squad as some unique characteristics that relate to the death penalty. So is there anything really different about Utah? Are there real differences in attitudes that we have towards it that are different from other states? And so to ask these questions, we need to have a way to answer. Well, we need to have a way to ask these questions to find those answers. So to tell us about the methodology of our study, we have Shelby and Zach.
Okay, as Admin was saying, we need to find a way to figure out Utahns' attitudes towards the death penalty. The basis of our instrument actually came from an article that we found during our literature reviews called Let 'Em Rot by Shad Maruna, which is this handsome man here, and Anna King. This was a study done in the UK about punitiveness and how individuals there felt about that.
A pilot study will be conducted here at Utah Valley University. 100 surveys will be distributed to students in various areas around campus. The purpose of our pilot study is to ensure the integrity of our instrument. In the study by Maruna and King that Shelby talked about, the specific subsets had Cronbach's alpha scores ranging from 0.64 to 0.82 with an overall composite value of 0.7. Because this is an established instrument with an acceptable reliability coefficient demonstrating internal consistency, we have made only minor changes which will be discussed later. We anticipate high internal validity in the pilot study, indicating that we're measuring what we intend to. Currently, we feel our survey is too long as it comprises 2 pages back and front. We hope that the pilot study will aid in dictating the best questions that we need to use and will also enable us to have a higher response rate when we have our actual study.
Okay, as we were thinking about our sample, there were specific demographics that we felt could influence Utahns' attitude towards the death penalty. We purposely selected 6 different cities within Utah that we felt best represented these characteristics, such as political party, education, income, things like that. For example, Camas, which is kind of a relatively small area in Utah, actually has a higher amount of Democrats than Republicans, which is unusual for the state. And because political party has such an influence, or we feel may have an influence on the death penalty, we wanted to make sure that areas where there are Democrats and things like that are represented as well. To do the survey, we'll be sending 6,000 surveys out. In his research, Shad actually had a response rate of between 30 and 40%, which is really high for a questionnaire. We expect and would be totally happy with the response rate of 20%, getting us about 1,000 surveys to represent the state of Utah. For the research, to actually just send out the surveys, it's going to cost us about $4,000. For the research in its entirety, it's about $9,125.
We have obtained a list of addresses from the United States Postal Service, which we'll be able to randomly select different individuals comprising our study. The random selection will be done to increase validity and also to eliminate bias. In Let 'Em Rot, the authors Maruna and King conducted their study. They sent out 3,600 surveys and got back 940, as Shelby talked about. We hope to get between 1,000 and 1,200 respondents from the 6,000 that we send out. A reminder postcard will be sent out 2 weeks after the initial study is sent out to aid in helping us achieve these values that Shelby talked about. We understand the limitations of our study as we exhibit selection bias in the reason why we chose each city, and our inability to generalize to the Utah population due to our purposive sampling method. In spite of the limitations, we are confident that this exploratory piece of research will establish a foundation for further studies to be done here in Utah on the death penalty.
Okay, so as I was talking about before, we based our instrument on one that we found in the Ledemrot article. Because this was done in the United Kingdom, we had to make some changes also because it was done on punitiveness, not necessarily on the death penalty in specific. So the changes that we made with permission by Shad were to account for the idiomatic differences. Some of the phrases in it were very English, so we Americanized them. We also did it to measure the specific demographics that I stated before that we feel would lend to influence the death or attitudes towards the death penalty. And then we also added our own questions towards the end in specific about the death penalty in specific so that we keep it within the topic. So the instrument, as you can see here, sorry, you can't read it very well, has 3 basic parts and is 4 pages long. The first 2 pages here are actually scaled with a Likert scale going from strongly disagree, disagree, slightly agree, agree, and strongly agree. How the individual has the opportunity to rate how they feel about the statement made above. Some of the questions we ask are, if the death penalty has to be used, it should be used sparingly and as a last option. So the respondent has the opportunity to select on the continuum with the Likert scale how they feel about that statement. Because we don't want to bias our survey, we have some that seem to be more for the death penalty and some questions that also are more against the death penalty, such as crime is a choice. A person's social circumstances aren't to blame. So again, the respondent would have the opportunity to circle how they feel about that question in the Likert scale area. Our second section here is actually our demographics. These were the specific things that we thought would influence an individual's opinion, as we discussed earlier, things like income level, we have race, we have questions about an individual's current occupation and their education level, things like that we would like to know if they influence those or not, or if there's any correlation. And then our third section, along this, is those last couple questions towards the end, are actually either commonly held myths or facts about the death penalty that the respondent selects whether they are true or false. And what we wanted to do with these is measure not only an individual's opinion and how they fall on this scale, but whether or not they actually know about the research or know about the death penalty and have done their homework on it and how that may influence their opinion. So some of those questions include, it costs more to imprison a person for life than to execute them. We know that that's actually not true with the appeals process and the cost of the actual execution and all the encompassing costs. It costs more to execute than it does to imprison for life. And so on the instrument, the individual would select whether that's true or false, and we get to have an idea whether what their opinion is based off and what kind of homework they've done on the death penalty.
In the second phase of our study, we have the opportunity to conduct interviews. This will require further IRB approval. If we decide to go ahead and conducting interviews, we will select 25 participants who strongly oppose the death penalty and 25 participants who strongly support it. The normal distribution shown is not to suggest that this is the distribution we expect from our study. We may likely obtain a distribution that is negatively or positively skewed, or one that is more leptokurtic or platokurtic. Regardless of the shape of the distribution, we want to account for both tails of the distribution and making sure that we measure both sides. We will now continue on with our presentation by hearing from Harmony and Amy, who will discuss the implications of our study here in Utah.
Okay, so we're going to discuss the purpose of our research and why it's important. Representative Handy, in an article in the Salt Lake Tribune, said, my main thing is to start a dialogue. It's time we can have an adult conversation. And that was about the death penalty. The Utah legislature is currently investigating issues surrounding the death penalty, primarily the cost, but they've also expressed interest in looking at our research. This is very important because the death penalty is a very serious issue. We grant our government the power to execute people if they've committed a crime, but it's not something that should be taken lightly. So it's very commendable that the legislature is looking at this. We can't say one way or the other whether or not public opinion really sways lawmakers, but I think it's important that they become aware of what the populace and the voters are thinking.
Okay, so we hope that throughout our research, the legislature will gain input from a wider section of the population here in Utah. And we also hope that through participation in our research, that the public will benefit from having their perspective considered. Currently in the state of Utah, 1 of 4 Utahns is not registered to vote. 1 of 3 registered actually vote, and Utah is ranked the 2nd to lowest state out of all 50 states as far as voter turnout. While there is no guarantee, it can be hoped that through participation, that those taking our survey may gain a broader understanding and interest in social issues such as the death penalty.
So the death penalty has been widely researched, as they mentioned, on a national and international level, but very little research of this nature has been done in Utah specifically. Because all research kind of contributes to the body of social science, we hope that ours will kind of create a base for future research in this area, and that more research of this kind can be done in individual states, both in Utah and other states. We hope that it'll be a good exploratory piece of research, and that it can highlight issues that need to be further explored by other studies. And with that, we'll pass you off for the conclusion. You guys won't have to listen to us anymore. You can ask questions. So.
Well, we're back. So just wrap things up real quick. Like I said before, mentioned that we're just undergraduate students doing exploratory research. However, during a legislative meeting in August, Dr. McGonigal-Smith mentioned our research, and in November, we have a meeting again that Dr. McGonigal-Smith is going to talk about our research again with the legislator. And
so some thanks are in order. We would like to thank UVU for their support in engaged learning, which is UVU's motto, and we are engaged and we are learning. We know that the experience will widen our opportunities as we go forward in our chosen professions. And we look forward to representing UVU at our conferences to discuss our findings, and we also hope to publish. And more thanks are in order for the 8th Annual Restorative Justice and Death Penalty Symposium for allowing us to present our research project. Also, the support of the College of the Human Social Sciences and the support of the Department of Behavioral Sciences. Also, we'd like to thank the Psychology Club for allowing us to join so that we can raise funds for our research on campus. And of course, thank you very much, fellow students, for coming here and learning with us today. And thank you, Sandy, for your great leadership. We certainly wouldn't be able to do this without your support and guidance. Sandy McGonigal-Smith is our primary investigator and our faculty advisor. And last but not least, the much appreciated funding provided by a grant from the Office of Engaged Learning. That's where most of our money's coming from. And thank you all for attending today.
we also like to thank esteemed guests for coming here and traveling here today. And we would like to invite the rest of the A team to come up for question and answer and comments, and just go easy on us.
No, there it comes.
Bring it on.
Bring it on. Right on.
What is there was 12 women correct that have been executed since 1976. So what is the trend been? Has that been an upwards trend, a downwards trend? And are you guys examining how people feel about women being executed versus men? Or are you not looking at that variable?
We do have a question in our survey that asks what people should be executed, men or women or juveniles and things like that. So we do have a question about that, but our research isn't specifically in that area. I don't know if we've examined the trend with women, since that's not specific to our study, but does anyone know?
To be honest, we just kind of pulled the statistics of like men and women and how it applied to the death penalty. Like you were saying with the numbers on the national scale, that's kind of how it applied. Other than that, we haven't really done a whole lot of information input on that, especially as it applies to Utah. So that's pretty much that.
There's a question back there.
Oh. Sure, we'll go back there first.
With the methodology of conducting the research, are there any other forms of conducting it, for instance, self-administered or telephone calls, or they make the cost?
There are definitely other options that we could have gone with. We contemplated, and we spent a lot of time figuring out how we wanted to send this out. We contemplated doing it over a web-based form such as like SurveyMonkey. We contemplated doing some different things like telephone interviews, and those are definitely viable options for further research. For the purposes of our study, because we wanted to be able to reach people who may or may not have access to a computer, who may or may not have access to a computer or may or may not have telephone access, we decided to do mail-in survey as the most traditional route. As we've stated, there is no perfect research. There may be other options for future studies, but for ours we decided to do solely mail-in surveys with the possibility of doing in-depth interviews after we receive the data and IRB approval for that. And then you had a question?
Yeah, I did.
Or comment.
Congratulations. This is a wonderful project in conception and what you're thinking of doing. My question is, have you thought about the feasibility of surveying the members of the legislature to get a sense about what issues they think are most salient, their attitudes? I say this for a couple of reasons. You're probably way ahead of me, but in New York, for example, where I'm from, such a survey was conducted, and it showed quite a considerable gap between what legislators assume the public wants and what the public may want, and it would also give you a sense of what they think is important, and also an opportunity to evaluate what impact your results might have, because you'd have a pre-baseline and then you show them your results. So have you thought about whether that is something you might be able to do or would want to do?
There was actually a group of us last night who was discussing this possibility, but we haven't. At this point in our study, I think it's a little late to be doing that, but for future research, I think it's a great idea. I know there's been a lot of research in that area, in that way, in criminal justice and stuff. I know there was a study done in the International Criminal Court about victims' rights, and they had some really good results and feedback by doing both. So that's a really good suggestion, but I think, we haven't discussed it as a group, but we have discussed it in small groups.
Like I said before, the legislator is interested in our research, and we plan on giving them our results and conclusion as part of this. So I know they are interested, but actually giving them the survey and having them do it and finding where they stand on the death penalty hasn't really been brought up in our focus or our research so far.
It's not too forward of me to ask this. Where do you all, as the research team, stand on the issue of the death penalty?
We don't know. We try, or we have discussed not to tell anyone. Nobody knows where anyone stands on this. Basically, we just want to keep it as less biased as possible. And so we don't know where anyone stands, who's for it, who's against it, neutral. We're just trying to keep it unbiased. So we don't know. And yeah.
You're not going to tell us on stage, thank you.
You had a question, right?
Yes, do you know what the average time that a person on death row is in prison before the execution takes place, and are those costs factored into your comparison to which is more expensive to someone?
I mean, it's about an average of a decade. However, there's a recent case where a man has been on death row for 35 years. So I would say anywhere between 10 and upwards of there.
And that was factored into the question of whether it costs more to execute or in prison, because that is a cost of executing an individual.
And that is in our survey. That's one of the questions.
The entire time they're in Supermax, and basically being in Supermax prison is very cost effective, and so that definitely adds into the price.
I just noticed in your methodology that all of your cities that you've chosen have been either northern Utah or central Utah, where everyone pretty much works and has a job or goes to school. Have you guys ever considered southern Utah, where there's a lot more retired individuals, like St. George area?
That's definitely, it's hard when you're trying to select a sample because you want to represent every characteristic ever possible to get in the results, but logistically it just didn't make sense. The reason that we picked the 6 cities were for the specific demographics. So like I said before, Camas has a really high democratic area, but they're also a rural community, so they will be more of the area that they will in part represent a portion of southern Utah. But we picked areas like West Valley for the fact that they have such a high minority population. Ogden has such a high crime rate, like way above the national average. So within picking those characteristics, we kind of feel for the others. When it comes down to it though, like we don't have a way to do every single type of person that there may be out there, such as southern Utah County. And we had to limit ourselves just based on cost and the fact that we don't have very long to do the research. Did you?
Thank you. Before we chose the 6 cities, we also did 40 different cities throughout the whole state. And what we were looking for was a representative sample that actually had skewed, like the bell. We did study all these characteristics out of 40 cities, and we chose those 6 out of the 40 cities that were very highly skewed based on what we were looking for.
Covered it. Well, we may have covered it well, but as stated, it's a purposive sampling, so it's under the umbrella of non-proportionate sampling. And so, as stated, we chose based on characteristics. For instance, Saratoga Springs was chosen because they have 44.5% of their residents have a bachelor's degree or higher, and 14.9% have a master's or professional degree. So we chose based on specific characteristics.
Does that make sense? We'll go you. I don't know if you actually had a question.
Okay, I'm actually from Camas.
Oh, okay.
So out of curiosity, are you specifically talking about the Camas as in the city Camas or as in the valley? Because the valley includes several different
The city.
The city.
Yeah, the city specifically.
So we can go by zip code?
Yeah, we do by zip code, and
yeah, that actually covers more.
it does, and it was a pain making a mailing list for it. Even though it's a small city there, it's still, I have over 1,000 addresses that we're gonna randomly select. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned in your, presentation that administering the death penalty is actually more expensive than just keeping the inmate locked up for life. So, my question is has there been discussion or attempts by individuals to look at the process and trying to reform, making the, administering the death penalty less expensive? And I understand that a lot of death, the reason why it is because, there's appeals, appeals processes and all that, so I understand that, but has there been discussion?
The legislature is actually looking at the cost right now, and they may or may not decide to streamline the process or something, but right now they're just trying to see what's going on with it and what they can do about it. So, if that makes any sense.
And is there a national discussion on that, or is it strictly within the state of Utah?
I would say nationally wide, with the states that do have the death penalty, that the cost is higher, and I would be safe to say that it is higher for someone on death row than to be imprisoned for life. So it is an issue and a topic that a legislator is interested in.
And also, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times, like I mentioned the people in Ecuador that were executed hours after their execution, right? In the U.S., a lot of people are exonerated from the death penalty. And so if we were to carry out, and the reason why we have the appeals processes, and it takes 10 years to go through all of that kind of stuff, is to make sure that we have the right guy, to make sure that we're not executing innocent people and that we're taking all the precautions so that we're not killing an innocent person, because I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. I'm sure you wouldn't, you know. And so that's one of the reasons why we have such a long and lengthy process, which costs money.
Did you guys find in your study a drop in the crime rate in those countries that have the
Surprisingly, no. Especially in the U.S., there was a study done asking, you know, is this a deterrent for specific types of crimes or whatever it is? And it actually doesn't. People are still going to do what they want to do. I mean, it's more of a cultural thing. The Asian countries have a lot less of a crime rate than most other places, but China is executing lots of people, you know? And so it has that cultural implication to it, and it still just comes to that idea that people are going to do what they want to do, and it's just try not to get caught.
Well, and most of the crimes that you can be executed for in most countries are kind of crimes of passion, you know, like stuff that you do in the heat of the moment a lot of the time. Well, do you get what I'm saying? It's a crime that someone has a lot of feelings about, and I think studies have shown that people aren't easily deterred from those sort of crimes, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
And that's something I'm sure other guest speakers who know so much more about the death penalty will probably cover.
You mentioned that the reason for those processes is to make sure that you have the right guy and all that. There's a certain percentage of death penalties, you know, people that have been executed that have actually found out to be innocent. Is that part of the discussion when they're talking about lowering the cost of the death penalties? How do we increase our chances of making sure we have the right guy, but also decrease the cost with all these appeals? Is that part of the conversation, or have they even touched on that?
That's not really part of our survey or research, but with new technology, DNA coming out, there's a lot of people that were taken off death row. And so like with new technology coming out and advances in that, like it does make it easier for us to know like they're guilty or not guilty.
And that's, like we said, not necessarily something that we're trying to study, but it's definitely something that affects an individual's opinion about the death penalty, whether they believe that there is the possibility or how likely it happens, how often it happens, that we do execute innocent people. So at the very least, that's something that will most likely come up in the minds of our participants as they read through the survey, because that is something that a lot of people want to know about when we're talking about and discussing the death penalty. You know, are we executing innocent people? How is that affecting? How often does it happen? All of those things, which are things that we don't necessarily address, but do influence opinion.
Our study doesn't specifically address it, but there is a question on our survey regarding that. So,
and I think it does affect cost too.
How might your findings affect the legislature's decisions?
You guys want me to do it? We can't say. All we know is that the legislature wants to look at it, and they're investigating the issues surrounding it right now. So obviously they're looking to see if the process is working or what can be fixed about it, or if it needs to be fixed at all. So we can't say for sure. They haven't told us specifically what influence it will have, but.
And our research is to not try to change anyone's opinion. It's just to find out where they stand on the death penalty. So having that information to the legislator will be useful in the future, I think.
So you said you had some mail surveys returned. Can you give us a general idea of what the findings are?
Oh, we haven't conducted the study yet. We're talking about what we're going to do. This is in the future plans, yeah. But we have our survey prepared. We're about to do the pilot study probably in a week or two here. And then once we get the pilot study back and fix our instrument, then we'll send out the mail surveys. And yeah.
Any more questions?
Okay, thank you very much.